Our planet has never been a passive backdrop to human history. It is an active, restless architect, constantly redesigning the very stage upon which our ancestors walked. The story of how we populated the world is not just a tale of human courage and curiosity. It is a deeper story written in shifting ice, rising seas, and colliding continents. These immense forces acted as gatekeepers for our species, opening doors of opportunity and then slamming them shut for millennia. By the end of this exploration, you will see the map of human history in a completely new light, understanding the 20 Earth changes that truly dictated where we could go. We will uncover how a lost continent in the North Pacific guided the first Americans, and why a paradise in the middle of the Sahara turned to dust, stranding entire cultures. How much of your own family story was decided by the mood of a glacier or the breath of a volcano? The first and most famous of these ancient gateways was not a narrow bridge but a continent in its own right. During the deep cold of the last great ice age, so much of the world's water was locked up in colossal ice sheets that global sea levels plummeted, falling by over 300 feet. In the far north, this retreating ocean revealed a staggering secret, an entire lost world now called Beringia. This was not a barren, icy wasteland as you might picture. The exposed floor of the Bering and Chukch ice seas created a subcontinent nearly 1,000 miles wide, a vast, rolling landscape of grasslands, shrubs, and rivers. It was a cold but incredibly productive ecosystem, a mammoth steppe teeming with life, from giant woolly mammoths and steppe bison to horses and caribou. For thousands of years, this was the sole terrestrial connection between the eastern and western hemispheres, a grassy highway linking Siberia to Alaska. The movement of people was not a single, hurried crossing, but a gradual process of exploration and settlement over generations, following the herds and adapting to this new environment. We know this not just from geology, which shows the ancient coastline, but from the bones of animals found on islands that were once inland hills, and most powerfully from human genetics, which traces a clear lineage from Siberian populations to the first peoples of the Americas. Then, as the world warmed, the gate began to close, the great ice sheets melted, and the oceans rose slowly and inexorably reclaiming that fertile plain. By around 11,000 years ago, the blue waters of the Bering Strait had returned, permanently severing the land connection between Asia and the Americas. The peoples who had journeyed east were now isolated, their world suddenly bounded by two immense oceans, setting the stage for an entirely independent chapter of human history to unfold. While the northern world had its Beringian Bridge, the tropical seas of Southeast Asia were undergoing an equally dramatic transformation. As those same ice age glaciers grew, locking away the ocean's water, coastlines retreated by hundreds of miles. What we see today as a vast blue archipelago scattered with thousands of islands was, for most of human history, something entirely different. The shallow continental shelf was laid bare, connecting modern-day Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and Bali into one enormous, contiguous peninsula extending from mainland Asia. This lost land is known to geologists as the Sunda Shelf. For early human populations moving south, this was not a journey across open water, but a gradual exploration of a new, connected continent, rich with forests and rivers. Yet, looking southeast from its shores, another world beckoned on the horizon, the separate continent of Sahul, a combined landmass of Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. Here, the ancient geography presented a far more formidable challenge. Between Sunda and Sahul lay a deep water trench, a remnant of the planet's tectonic dance that the falling sea levels could never bridge. Even at the Ice Age's peak, when the seas were at their lowest, this channel remained, a formidable blue barrier dotted with islands but demanding a conscious, daring voyage across open ocean. This was not a walk across a grassy plain. The first successful crossing to Sahul, over 50,000 years ago, stands as one of the most profound testaments to early human ingenuity. It represents our species' first major maritime migration, a journey that required not just a raft or a canoe, but an understanding of currents, winds, and the very concept of a distant shore beyond the horizon. Those first explorers, setting out from the visible islands of eastern Sunda, were navigating into the true unknown. Their successful arrival in a new world, isolated from all other human populations, would allow cultures to evolve in spectacular and unique directions for tens of thousands of years, until rising seas at the end of the Ice Age would once again redraw the map, flooding the Sunda shelf and transforming Sahul into the separate lands we recognize today. But the story of these shifting gateways is not confined to the edges of continents or the depths of ancient seas. Some of the most dramatic transformations occurred in the very heart of the world's largest desert. Today, the Sahara is a symbol of absolute desolation, an ocean of sand and stone stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, a seemingly impassable barrier. Yet this was not always so. The desert has a heartbeat, a rhythm dictated by the slow wobble of the Earth on its axis. Roughly every 20,000 years, this celestial cycle tilts North Africa to receive more monsoon rains. When this happens, the Sahara undergoes a metamorphosis so complete it defies belief. The dunes retreat, replaced by vast grasslands. Dry basins fill with freshwater lakes, some as large as modern-day Germany. Rivers carve channels through what is now only rock, creating networks that support hippos, crocodiles, elephants, and giraffes. This is the Green Sahara, a window of opportunity that swung open for our ancestors not once but repeatedly. During these lush periods, the desert did not separate Africa, it connected it. The once formidable barrier became a vibrant corridor, a savanna highway that allowed people, animals, and ideas to flow freely between North Africa and the lands south of the desert. We know this not from theory, but from the silent testimony left in the most barren places. In the middle of the modern-day Libyan desert, archaeologists have found the resting places of communities who lived by the shores of a giant lake, leaving behind tools and ceremonial items. In the Tenere Desert of Niger, a vast expanse of nothingness, researchers have uncovered ancient settlements where people fished and herded cattle. These sites are like messages in a bottle, proving that what is now an empty quarter was once a center of life. Then the celestial clock would tick forward, the monsoons would shift, and the gateway would slam shut. The lakes would evaporate, the rivers would vanish, and the grasslands would wither back into sand. The Sahara returned, more formidable than before, isolating the populations on either side. This cyclical isolation had profound consequences. For generations, people who had been connected were now separated, their cultures and genetics evolving independently until the next green window opened, perhaps thousands of years later, allowing for new mixtures and migrations. This pulsating rhythm of connection and isolation, dictated by the tilt of a planet, is written into the very DNA of African populations, a genetic record of deserts that bloomed and faded, acting as a slow, rhythmic valve controlling the flow of human history across the continent. While the Sahara's green phases offered a sporadic northern exit, one land bridge stood firm through every climatic shift. The Sinai Peninsula is a geographic keystone, a triangular wedge of desert that has persistently connected Africa to Asia for millions of years. Unlike the fleeting corridors of Beringia or the Green Sahara, this was a permanent fixture, a stubborn geological fact that made it the inevitable main gate for our species' final exodus from its ancestral home. Its geography is a study in funneled movement. To the west lies the vast, watery barrier of the Mediterranean Sea, to the east the impassable trench of the Red Sea. Between them, the Sinai acts as the only solid overland path, a narrow bottleneck of sand and stone that directed every step. For any group of early Homo sapiens moving north or east out of Africa, the choice was simple: turn back or cross the Sinai. This constancy, however, did not mean the crossing was always easy or inviting. The viability of this gateway was controlled not by its own existence, but by the climatic conditions in the lands that bookended it. The Sinai itself is and always has been a harsh desert. A successful migration required more than just a dry path. It required a reason to leave and a destination worth reaching. When the Sahara was green and lush to the south, the pressure to move may have been lower. But when the desert phases returned, creating hardship and pushing populations toward the Mediterranean coast and the Nile Valley, the Sinai became the obvious escape valve. Simultaneously, conditions in the Levant, the fertile region at the bridge's northern exit, had to be hospitable. During warmer, wetter periods, the Levant bloomed with forests and grasslands, offering a powerful lure. During colder, drier spells linked to northern ice ages, it could become a forbidding extension of the desert itself, a dead end. So the great human migrations through this corridor likely pulsed in waves, timed to those rare windows when hardship pushed from behind and opportunity pulled from ahead. Think of it not as a door that was always open, but as a passageway whose threshold was governed by the weather reports from two different continents. The people who finally crossed it for good did not simply wander out. They were precisely timed emigrants, reading the subtle signals of a changing world. Their passage through this unassuming strip of desert set in motion the populating of Europe, Asia, and ultimately the entire planet, making the Sinai the most consequential traffic junction in the deep history of our species. The Sinai was not the only door out of Africa. Look east from the Horn of Africa today, and you see only the shimmering, impassable waters of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. But during those same pivotal windows of climate change, when ice sheets grew and sea levels fell, another world emerged. The Arabian Peninsula, a land we now associate with endless sand dunes and scorching heat, underwent a transformation just as radical as the Saharas. In its wet phases, it became a green and welcoming land, offering a second coastal highway for human expansion. The evidence for this lost paradise is etched into the landscape itself. Satellite imagery reveals the ghosts of ancient river systems snaking beneath the sands, vast networks that once channeled monsoon rains from the mountains to the interior. Archaeologists have found the beds of immense freshwater lakes, some over 100 miles long, in places that are now absolute desert. These were not temporary puddles, but persistent bodies of water that could have supported life for centuries. This green Arabia was a corridor of life stretching from the southern tip of the peninsula all the way north toward the Levant. For small bands of early humans living along the African coast, the view across the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait would have changed dramatically. At its narrowest, with sea levels 100 feet lower, the crossing to southern Arabia shrank to just a few miles, a short voyage between visible shores. Once across, instead of a desert, they would have found a landscape of lake shores and river valleys, rich with game and freshwater resources. This route may have served as a vital alternative or even a primary path during periods when the Sinai corridor was less hospitable, perhaps due to aridity in the northern regions. It allowed for a coastal migration where people could move steadily northward, rarely venturing far from reliable water sources. This journey along the fringes of a green peninsula would have been a very different experience from the inland trek across the Sinai. But like all gates governed by climate, this one too was destined to close. As the global climate shifted again, the monsoons weakened and retreated southward. The rivers slowed to a trickle, then vanished. The Great Lakes evaporated, leaving behind only salt flats and fossils. the lush grasslands browned and died, and the sands began their relentless advance. The green corridor withered away, transforming Arabia into the hyper-arid barrier we know today. This aridification did more than just make a route difficult. It erased it completely, redirecting the entire flow of human migration. Later movements out of Africa would have found this coastal door sealed shut, forcing all traffic back through the continental bottleneck of the Sinai. The memory of that green world, however, is not entirely lost. It lives on in the stone tools left on ancient lake shores, now surrounded by a sea of sand, and in the genetic threads of populations whose ancestors once walked through a garden that time forgot. Millions of years before the first human footstep would echo across its soil, the stage for the final continental migration was being set by the slow, grinding dance of tectonic plates. Far to the south, a monumental geological event was reaching its climax, an event that would not only connect two worlds but would fundamentally alter the climate of the entire planet. This was the formation of the Isthmus of Panama. For eons, North and South America had been separate island continents, drifting in isolation like biological arcs, each developing its own unique and spectacular cast of creatures. South America was home to bizarre marsupials and giant, lumbering ground sloths, while North America was dominated by familiar groups like cats, dogs, and elephants. Then, roughly 3 million years ago, volcanic activity and the relentless push of the Pacific Plate forced a chain of islands upward, slowly bridging the seaway between the two landmasses. This was not a sudden event, but a gradual closure, like a drawbridge being painstakingly raised over millions of years. When the final connection was made, it created the last major land corridor on Earth, a narrow strip of land that would forever change life on two continents. The result was the Great American Biotic Interchange, a colossal mixing of species that had been separated for over 100 million years. Imagine the scene as animals began to tentatively explore this new land bridge. North American predators like the saber-toothed cat and the dire wolf moved south, encountering the giant, armored glyptodonts and massive ground sloths of South America. In return, South American species like the opossum and the armadillo made their way north. This biological traffic reshaped ecosystems on a continental scale, leading to waves of competition, adaptation, and extinction. But the isthmus did more than just swap animals. It rewired the planet's oceans. By closing the Central American Seaway, it blocked the free flow of warm water between the Atlantic and Pacific. This forced ocean currents into new patterns, most notably strengthening the Gulf Stream, which began pumping vast amounts of warm, salty water north toward the Arctic. Many climate scientists believe this was the trigger that plunged the Earth into its current cycle of intense ice ages by increasing snowfall in the northern latitudes. So this geological accident set the very climatic stage upon which our own species would later evolve, in a world of advancing and retreating ice. For us, the isthmus's ultimate role was as the final continental doorway. When the first human explorers, descendants of those who crossed the vanished Beringia, finally worked their way down through the continents, they encountered this ancient land bridge. It served as a funnel, guiding them from the diverse landscapes of Central America into the vast, uncharted wilderness of South America. They crossed a corridor that was, by then, teeming with the mixed legacy of that great interchange, a living museum of a world remade by geology. In crossing the Isthmus of Panama, they were walking across the suture line of two ancient worlds, a bridge built by planetary forces that had, long before their arrival, decided the fate of continents and the rhythm of the ice itself. Yet another doorway was not made of land, but of its absence, carved by retreating mountains of ice. As the last great glaciation waned, and the immense Laurentide ice sheet covering eastern North America began to pull back from the smaller Cordilleran sheet hugging the western mountains, a narrow gap was born between them. This was the proposed ice-free corridor, a sliver of land running along the eastern flank of the Rocky Mountains, from Alaska down into the heart of the continent. For decades, this corridor was the reigning star of archaeological theory, celebrated as the grand highway that allowed the descendants of the Beringian migrants, the famed Clovis people with their distinctive spear points, to swiftly move south and populate the Americas. It was a compelling and logical story, a path of least resistance opening just in time for human expansion. The landscape itself seemed to tell the tale, a passageway freed from ice where plants would pioneer, animals would graze, and humans would follow. But a good story often faces challenges from new evidence. The corridor theory began to show cracks under closer scrutiny. The central question became one of timing. Geological studies started to suggest that while the two ice sheets did separate, the newborn corridor was not a welcoming paradise. For centuries, it may have been a barren, icy wasteland, a landscape of glacial rubble, meltwater lakes, and scarce resources, a tunnel of hardship rather than a highway of opportunity. By the time it became truly habitable with established ecosystems that could support human hunters, there is growing evidence that people were already far to the south. Archaeologists have uncovered sites in places like Monte Verde in Chile and Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania that suggest a human presence in the Americas potentially centuries before the corridor could have been a viable route. This evidence points powerfully toward an alternative, the coastal migration theory. This idea proposes that the first peoples moved not through the inland ice, but along the Pacific coastline. As the ice sheets grew, they locked up so much water that the continental shelf was exposed, creating a potentially rich coastal plain, now submerged under hundreds of feet of ocean. This route would have offered a wealth of marine resources, from fish and shellfish to sea mammals, providing a reliable food source for a traveling population. It was a different kind of corridor, one not defined by the retreat of ice, but by the very edge of the continent itself. The debate between these two theories, the inland ice-free corridor and the coastal route, is one of the great detective stories in archaeology. It forces us to reconsider a fundamental narrative. Did the great ice sheets open a door through their center, or did they instead push humanity to its fringes, to the very boundary between land and sea? The answer may not be a simple either-or. It is entirely possible that both routes were used by different groups or at different times, as the ever-changing climate dictated which path was more forgiving. The opening and closing of the ice did not offer a single solution, but a menu of perilous choices, and our ancestors were adept at reading the landscape to find their way forward. But the most dramatic evidence of a lost world lies not in sand, but beneath the cold, grey waters of the North Sea. Today, we call that expanse Doggerland, a haunting name borrowed from the Dogger Bank, a submerged sandbank that was once its central hill country. During the last great ice age, when Britain was not an island but a western peninsula of Europe, this entire basin was a vast, low-lying plain, stretching from the white cliffs of Dover to the coasts of Denmark and the Netherlands. It was a landscape of rolling hills, meandering rivers, dense forests, and wide lagoons, a fertile and inhabited world. For millennia, it was not a barrier but a bridge, the very heartland of a region that connected people and cultures. Archaeologists trawling the seafloor have brought up tangible proof of this lost reality, not just stone tools, but the antlers of giant elk, the bones of mammoths, and even finely crafted bone harpoons dropped by Mesolithic hunters. This was not an empty frontier, but a settled, resource-rich homeland. Then the world warmed and the ice sheets at the poles began to weep. As the glaciers melted, the oceans rose with a terrible, relentless patience. The change was not a single catastrophic flood, but a slow, creeping invasion over 2,000 years, from around 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. The sea would advance, swallowing coastal forests and forcing communities to retreat to higher ground. only to pause for generations before advancing again. Rivers swelled into estuaries, low-lying valleys became bays, and the hills became islands until one by one, those too vanished beneath the waves. The final severance, when the last land bridge near the Strait of Dover was overwhelmed, was a quiet geological event with profound human consequences. In a relatively short span of generations, Britain was transformed from a European peninsula into an island. The populations living there were suddenly cut off, their connection to the continent reduced to a dangerous and uncertain voyage across open water. This physical isolation would echo through millennia, shaping a distinct cultural and genetic path. The memory of this drowned world, however, never fully faded. It lingers in the collective imagination, perhaps reflected in ancient folklore from cultures around the North Sea, stories of sunken cities and lost lands swallowed by the hungry ocean. Doggerland is a powerful reminder that the maps we take for granted are temporary, and that some of the most significant borders in human history were not drawn by kings or treaties, but by the rising tide. Far to the east of those rising North Sea waters, another form of drowning was taking place, not by ocean, but by its absence. Central Asia today calls to mind images of vast, arid steppes and sweeping deserts, a landscape seemingly defined by a lack of water. Yet this too is a memory of a wetter world. Scattered across this immense region were once colossal inland seas, freshwater giants that acted as the beating hearts of ancient ecosystems. The Aral Sea, now a tragic symbol of modern environmental collapse, was merely the last remnant of a body of water that once dwarfed it. In the deep past, lakes like the Aral and Balkhash were many times their historical size, fed by mighty rivers flowing from distant mountain glaciers. These were not isolated ponds, but vast, life-giving oases that transformed the surrounding land. Around their shores, a green world flourished with lush reed beds, riparian forests, and grasslands stretching far into what is now barren ground. For the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of prehistory, these mega-lakes were more than just sources of water. They were the anchors for entire networks of movement. Think of each great lake as a central hub in a continental system. The fertile corridors radiating from their shores functioned like prehistoric silk roads, long before the concept of silk or roads existed. They provided reliable routes for seasonal migration, allowing communities and their herds to move across the steppe with confidence, knowing that water and pasture awaited at predictable intervals. These green corridors connected distant mountain valleys to the open plains, facilitating not just the movement of people, but the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across thousands of miles. This was a connected world made possible by the presence of these immense, stable water sources. Then the climate began to shift. As the post-Ice Age world settled into a warmer, drier phase, the delicate balance that sustained these inland seas was disrupted. The mountain glaciers that fed their rivers retreated or vanished. Rainfall patterns changed. Slowly, inexorably, the mega-lakes began to shrink. The process was a slow desiccation, a parching that took place over centuries. Shorelines retreated by miles. What was once open water became marshy wetland, then dry salt flat. The green corridors that depended on that water withered and fragmented, breaking apart like a mirror shattering. The consequences for human populations were profound. The wide, open networks of movement began to constrict and collapse. No longer could people range freely across the greenways between lakes. They were increasingly funneled into the remaining pockets of reliable water, primarily the permanent river valleys that snaked down from the high mountains. This geographical compression had a dramatic effect on settlement and culture. Populations that had been dispersed across a wide, interconnected landscape were now forced into closer proximity along these vital waterways. Competition for the best pastures and water access likely intensified. This pressure cooker environment along the Amu Darya, Surdarya, and other major rivers may have accelerated social complexity, encouraging the formation of larger, more organized communities for mutual defense and resource management. It set the stage for the rise of the first great oasis cities and trading centers that would, millennia later, become the legendary stops on the historical Silk Road. The ancient highways of the steppe, paved not with stone but with grass and sustained by giant lakes, had vanished. In their place, humanity was pushed toward the rivers, beginning a new chapter where control of water, not freedom of movement, would become the key to survival and power in the heart of Asia. The Great Lakes of Asia were not the only source of climate-altering catastrophe. Sometimes the planet itself would erupt in a fury so profound it threatened to rewrite the entire story. Roughly 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a volcano named Toba did not simply erupt, it detonated. This was a supereruption, an event of almost unimaginable scale, ejecting over 2,000 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and sulfurous gases high into the stratosphere. To put that in perspective, it was thousands of times more powerful than the famous eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. The immediate aftermath around the Indian Ocean would have been apocalyptic, with ash falls meters thick smothering the landscape for thousands of miles. But the real danger was global. Those immense plumes of sulfur dioxide encircled the Earth, reflecting sunlight back into space and plunging the planet into a volcanic winter that may have lasted for a decade. Temperatures are estimated to have plummeted by as much as 5 to 10 degrees Celsius globally, with even sharper drops in the northern latitudes. This was not just a bad few years, this was a sudden, violent shock to a world already in the grip of an ice age. For the small, scattered populations of early Homo sapiens struggling to survive, this event may have been the ultimate bottleneck. The theory, first proposed in the 1990s, suggests that the prolonged winter and the collapse of plant life it caused would have led to widespread famine. The global human population, already low, may have crashed to just a few thousand breeding pairs, clinging to survival in isolated refuges, perhaps in coastal areas where marine resources could still be found. This genetic bottleneck, if it occurred, would explain a curious feature in our DNA, a surprising lack of diversity that suggests all humans alive today descended from a very small ancestral population around this same time. It is a dramatic story, a tale of a species brought to the very brink of extinction by a single geological tantrum. Yet, like all compelling theories, this one has faced intense scrutiny and debate. Recent archaeological discoveries have challenged the severity of the impact. At sites in India, for example, stone tools found both above and below the thick layer of Toba ash appear remarkably similar. This continuity suggests that human populations in the region were not wiped out, they persisted through the event. Some climate models now indicate the volcanic winter, while severe, may have been shorter or more regionally focused than once thought. The debate now centers on resilience. Were our ancestors so fragile that a single event nearly erased them, or were they already adaptable generalists capable of shifting strategies, moving to new areas, and weathering the climatic storm? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. The Toba eruption was undoubtedly a planet-altering catastrophe, a grim filter that tested every living thing. Some human groups undoubtedly perished, their lineages lost forever. Others, perhaps those in more favorable environments or with more flexible survival strategies, endured. This event did not necessarily halt global migration, but it may have dramatically reshaped it, pruning some branches of the human family tree while forcing the survivors into new patterns of movement and adaptation. It serves as a stark reminder that our journey was never a steady, inevitable march, but a precarious trek through a world capable of unimaginable violence, where the very air could turn against us, and the future of our species could hinge on the resilience of a few small bands in scattered, sheltered corners of the globe. While supervolcanoes could choke the skies, the most persistent barriers were often the simplest, a line drawn by the sea itself. At the southern tip of the Red Sea, where Africa and Arabia almost touch, lies the narrow gate of the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait. Today, this is a formidable marine channel, roughly 20 miles wide at its narrowest. Its deep blue waters a clear and daunting division between two continents. But during the long winters of the ice ages, when the oceans retreated, this geography told a very different story. With sea levels falling by over 300 feet, the exposed continental shelves on both sides would have extended the coastlines outward, dramatically shrinking the open water gap. The crossing point may have narrowed to as little as 8 or 10 miles, and crucially, the strait itself would have become much shallower. This transformation turns a modern-day map on its head. What is now a significant maritime barrier could, for millennia at a time, have become a visible, tantalizingly close stepping stone. The mountains of the Horn of Africa and the highlands of Yemen would have been within sight of each other across a much reduced channel, perhaps dotted with islands that are now submerged seamounts. This does not mean the crossing was ever easy or without risk. Even at its narrowest, it remained a voyage across open water, a challenge demanding planning and basic maritime technology like simple rafts. But the psychological and practical difference is immense. A journey of 20 miles of open ocean feels like a leap into the void, while a crossing of 10 miles to a visible shoreline, possibly broken up by intermediate islands, feels like a series of achievable hops. For early human groups adapted to coastal living, exploiting shellfish and other marine resources, this narrowed strait presented a conceivable, if daring, opportunity. It shifts the southern exit from Africa from a near impossibility to a plausible, climate-driven doorway that opened and closed with the rhythm of the ice ages. When the world warmed and the glacial meltwaters poured back into the ocean basins, the gate swung shut again. The rising sea would have flooded the newly exposed shelves, deepening the channel and pushing the coastlines back. The visible islands would have vanished, and the 20-mile-wide blue barrier would have returned, more imposing than before. This cyclical opening and closing created a punctuated opportunity for migration. A group that made the crossing during a glacial low stand would find themselves in a new world, and within a few thousand years, their route back would be permanently severed by the rising tide, isolating them in Arabia. This strait, more than any other, highlights how a few dozen vertical feet of water level could decide the fate of continents, transforming a daunting sea into a passable corridor and then back into an impassable moat, all on a schedule written by the growth and decay of distant ice. Long before humans walked the Earth, a tectonic divorce of continental proportions was quietly setting the stage for our entire climatic reality. Far to the south, a final, decisive separation was taking place. For eons, the tail of South America had been loosely tethered to the Antarctic Peninsula, a connection that acted as a dam, blocking the free flow of the world's oceans. Then, roughly 30 million years ago, the relentless forces of plate tectonics finally ripped that land bridge apart. This created the Drake Passage, the deepest and most ferocious stretch of ocean on the planet, a 600-mile-wide moat of churning water between Cape Horn and the Antarctic islands. The opening of this passage was a geological event with planetary consequences. It allowed for the birth of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a river of seawater that flows unimpeded around the entire globe, driven by the relentless westerly winds of the Southern Ocean. With no continents to block its path, this current became the most powerful on Earth, a continuous, chilly loop that isolated Antarctica in a frigid embrace. The current acted like a thermal fence, preventing warmer waters from the equatorial regions from reaching the southern continent. This allowed Antarctica to grow its immense permanent ice sheet, turning it into the planet's refrigerator. That growing ice cap had a cascading effect, lowering global sea levels and altering atmospheric circulation patterns worldwide. In essence, the opening of the Drake Passage triggered the global cooling that plunged Earth into the Pleistocene ice ages, the very epoch of advancing and retreating glaciers that framed the entire human story. Every migration route we have discussed, from the grassy plains of Beringia to the drowned forests of Doggerland, was made possible or erased by the sea level changes driven by these ice age cycles. So when we talk about ancient humans waiting for a land bridge to appear or fleeing from rising seas, we are witnessing the final, human-scale consequences of a door that opened in the ocean 30 million years prior. Our ancestors' opportunities were dictated by the slow, deep-time legacy of a continent drifting away, and a current that began to circle the bottom of the world, locking in the cold that would both challenge and guide our species. A different kind of gateway is being forged right now in the clear, frigid waters between two continents. In Iceland, you can literally swim or snorkel through the Silfra Rift, a crack in the Earth's skin filled with glacial meltwater so pure you can drink it. This is not a path taken by ancient hunters, but something far more profound. It is a live camera feed into the deep time engine that builds our world. Here, the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are slowly, inexorably pulling apart from each other at about the speed your fingernails grow. That tiny, relentless motion, repeated over millions of years, is the same force that heaves up mountain ranges, tears continents in half, and opens entirely new ocean basins. The Silfra Rift is a symbolic birth canal for geography itself. It shows us the foundational truth that every migration route we have explored, every land bridge and sunken corridor, was first sketched by these unimaginably patient movements far below our feet. The grassy highway of Beringia existed because the plates had arranged the continents in a certain way. The drowning of Doggerland happened because the ocean basins, themselves created by plate tectonics, had space to fill with meltwater. These plates are the ultimate stage managers, rearranging the scenery on a timescale we can scarcely comprehend. While a single human lifetime sees only stillness, over millennia these forces open and close the grandest doors of all, creating new worlds and sealing away old ones. They remind us that the map is not fixed, it is a single frame in a very, very long movie, and we are simply living through one fleeting scene. The power of water to carve a path through the most forbidding landscapes is written in the very bones of the Sahara. We have seen the desert turn green, but that transformation was not a uniform blanket of grass. It was channeled, directed, and given life by colossal river systems that have since vanished from the earth. One of the most staggering was the Tamanrasset River. Today, that name belongs to a town in southern Algeria, a dot in a sea of sand. But beneath that sand, satellite radar has revealed the ghost of a watercourse on an almost continental scale. This ancient river once began in the southern highlands of the Sahara, gathering the monsoon rains, and then flowed for over 900 miles northwest across the entire width of the desert, finally emptying into the Atlantic Ocean near Mauritania. Its basin was immense, comparable to the modern Ganges-Brahmaputra system. During the Sahara's green phases, this was not a mere stream, but a mighty, perennial river, a blue lifeline cutting through a sea of grass. For human communities, such a river was more than just a source of water. It was a built-in navigation system. You did not need to memorize stars or landmarks to traverse the desert. You simply followed the river. Its banks offered the richest pastures, the densest groves of trees, and the most reliable concentrations of game. It acted as a natural highway, guiding movement with absolute certainty from the interior highlands all the way to the Atlantic coast. Settlements would have clustered along its fertile corridor, creating a chain of connected communities across a landscape that would later become utterly impassable. But the highway had a toll, and the price was paid in climate. As the African monsoon weakened and shifted southward, the rains that fed the Tamanrasset grew sporadic, then ceased. The great river began to fail. First, it would have broken into a chain of large lakes, then into a string of shrinking oases, and finally, the flow stopped entirely. The water retreated underground, and the sun-baked channel filled with wind-blown sand. The highway became a dry tomb, its route only visible from space or in the eerie, water-worn pebbles found deep in the desert, far from any modern water source. This pattern repeated across the Sahara with other lost giants, like the Urhaha River in Libya. Their disappearance did not just make travel difficult, it shattered a continent's internal map. The connected corridor became a series of isolated islands, the scattered oases. Populations that had been in contact for generations were suddenly stranded, separated by hundreds of miles of hyper-arid desert where before there had been a flowing road. Some groups would have contracted around the remaining oases, their worlds shrinking to the site of a single palm grove. Others may have been forced on desperate treks to find the next reliable water, a journey that now carried immense risk. The rivers that had unified the landscape now left behind a legacy of division, their fossilized beds standing as silent monuments to a time when the desert did not separate but connected. This story of drowned worlds finds perhaps its most debated chapter in the quiet waters of the Black Sea. For most of human history, this vast inland sea was not salty, and it was not full. During the last glacial period, it was a much smaller, isolated freshwater lake, its surface hundreds of feet below the global ocean level. A natural limestone sill across what is now the Bosphorus Strait acted as a perfect dam, holding back the waters of the Mediterranean. Around its lush, fertile shores, some archaeologists hypothesize early farming communities thrived for millennia, building villages on what was then a gently sloping coastline. Then the world warmed. As the great ice sheets melted, global sea levels rose with a relentless global pressure. The Mediterranean began to climb, creeping up the slopes of that Anatolian dam. The moment of breach, according to one dramatic theory, was not a slow seep but a cataclysm. Roughly 7,600 years ago, the rising saltwater may have finally topped the rocky sill and begun to carve through it. What followed could have been a torrent of biblical proportions. The relatively soft limestone would have eroded rapidly, turning a trickle into a thunderous cascade. The hypothesis suggests the Mediterranean poured into the Black Sea basin in an immense, roaring waterfall, hundreds of times greater than Niagara Falls today. The basin would have filled at an astonishing rate, perhaps rising as much as 6 inches per day, its shoreline advancing by over a mile each week. For any communities living along that ancient lower coastline, this was not a change they could adapt to over generations. It was a relentless, drowning pursuit. The freshwater lake they knew vanished, replaced by a rising, salty ocean that swallowed their fields, their homes, and their entire world within a human lifetime. The geography was rewritten, and a vast new sea was born. The scientific debate around this event is intense, with some researchers pointing to sediment cores that show a sudden shift from freshwater to saltwater mollusk shells, while others argue for a more gradual transition. Yet the cultural echo of such an event, if it occurred, is undeniable. This region is a cradle of ancient civilizations, and the memory of a catastrophic flood that forced a mass displacement of people could have traveled with those refugees for centuries, passed down through oral tradition. It offers a compelling geological possibility for the root of a story found in countless cultures, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Book of Genesis, a universal myth of a great deluge that cleansed the world. Beyond myth, the breaching of the Bosphorus represented a brutal and final closing of a door. It did not just flood land, it erased an entire ancient coastline, a network of coastal routes and river valleys that had served as homelands and highways. That sudden loss of territory would have pushed populations inland and westward, perhaps accelerating the spread of Neolithic farming knowledge into Europe. Whether a single catastrophic event or a rapid geological process, the transformation of the Black Sea stands as a powerful symbol of how the planet can reclaim its own geography, turning settled lands into legends lying silent beneath the waves. While rivers vanished in the desert, a far greater wall was rising to the south, built by the slowest and most powerful force of all. The ongoing collision of the Indian subcontinent with the Eurasian plate is a planetary event in real time, a crash that began 50 million years ago and continues today, pushing the Himalayas upward by a few millimeters each year. This monumental tectonic effort did more than just create the world's highest peaks. It fundamentally reshaped the sky above. The sheer mass of the Himalayas and the colossal Tibetan Plateau, often called the roof of the world, acts as a massive barrier to atmospheric circulation. It forces the powerful jet stream to bend and divert, and it blocks moisture-laden winds from the Indian Ocean, wrenching the very climate of Asia into a new pattern. The consequences were twofold, creating a stark environmental divide. To the north, in the heart of the continent, the rains were stolen. As the moist air slammed into the southern slopes of the Himalayas, it was forced upward, cooling and dumping nearly all of its precipitation. This left the lands beyond the mountains, the vast interior of Central Asia, in a profound rain shadow. The process contributed decisively to the aridification of the region, transforming what may have been more mixed landscapes into the dry steppes and deserts we know today. This drying closed off the once wetter corridors that earlier human relatives like the Denisovans may have used, and it created the formidable Gobi and Taklamakan deserts, barriers that would later challenge and channel the Silk Road traders. Yet, on the southern side of this mountainous wall, the same uplift had the opposite effect. By heating the air above the Tibetan Plateau in summer, it created a powerful low-pressure system that acts like a giant atmospheric pump, forcefully drawing in the wet monsoon winds from the Indian Ocean. This intensification of the Asian monsoon cycle brought drenching, predictable rains to South and Southeast Asia, sustaining lush rainforests and fertile river valleys like the Indus and the Ganges. For hundreds of thousands of years, these tectonically crafted climates dictated the rules of human movement. The arid north funneled populations along river oases and mountain passes, while the wet, fertile south supported dense, settled populations along its coasts and floodplains. The Himalayas did not just separate nations, they created entire weather systems, acting as the ultimate climate engineer that determined which parts of Asia were gardens and which were gauntlets, long before the first human ever looked upon their snow-capped peaks. But the power of water to reshape a continent was not always a slow, creeping rise. In the Pacific Northwest of America, at the very end of the last ice age, it arrived with a roar. A colossal ice dam, part of the Great Cordilleran Ice Sheet, had plugged a deep valley in what is now western Montana, trapping the meltwaters of retreating glaciers. This created glacial Lake Missoula, an inland sea containing more water than Lake Ontario and Lake Erie combined, held back by a wall of ice over 2,000 feet high. The pressure from this immense, restless lake was unimaginable, and then the dam failed. The ice did not simply crack, it shattered in a cataclysmic release. The entire lake, all 500 cubic miles of it, exploded westward in a single, titanic surge. This was not a river flood, it was a wall of water and ice hundreds of feet high, moving at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour, a force that could strip bedrock clean. It scoured its way across the Columbia Plateau in eastern Washington, tearing up the earth and carving a bizarre, scarred landscape now known as the Channeled Scablands. This is a place where geology looks wounded, a vast network of dry canyons, colossal potholes, and abandoned waterfalls etched directly into solid basalt. The floodwaters then funneled into the Columbia River Gorge, backing up into tributary valleys and reshaping everything in their path before finally draining into the Pacific Ocean. And then the cycle began again. As the ice sheet retreated, it would reform the dam. Lake Missoula would refill over centuries, and the pressure would build until the ice could hold no more. This happened not once, but dozens of times over 2,000 years. The landscape became a stage for a recurring planetary drama of creation and utter destruction. For any plants, animals, or the earliest human inhabitants of the region, this presented a world of profound instability. An ecosystem could establish itself in the quiet centuries between floods, with forests growing and herds grazing across the plateau. Then, with little warning, the ground would tremble, and a sound like the end of the world would echo from the east. The tsunami of ice, cold water, and debris would erase everything in its main path, scouring the land down to bedrock and leaving behind a barren, rocky desert. It would drown entire valleys, stranding creatures on suddenly isolated hills that became temporary islands. The routes people and animals used for migration, the river valleys that were natural highways, could be utterly unrecognizable from one century to the next, filled with colossal gravel bars and house-sized boulders carried from hundreds of miles away. This was not a static environment to adapt to, but a periodically resetting one, a hazard on a scale beyond any storm or wildfire. To live here required a deep cultural memory, stories passed down for generations about the signs of the lake filling, the trembling of the earth, and the safe high grounds to flee toward. It demanded a resilience not just to seasonal change, but to the occasional, unimaginable violence of the planet itself remaking its face. The channeled scablands stand today as a monument to that raw power, a stark lesson that some of the doors in our world do not swing open gently, but are kicked off their hinges by a force that can, in a matter of days, redraw the map of an entire region. The immense floodwaters of the Pacific Northwest were a regional reset, but across the ocean, a far larger and slower drowning was reaching its conclusion. We return to Southeast Asia, to the vast Sunda shelf that once connected its great islands to the Asian mainland. The end of the Ice Age did not merely flood a coastal plain here, it erased a subcontinent. As the glaciers melted and the oceans rose, the sea advanced across this low-lying world not in a sudden surge, but with a patient, relentless creep over thousands of years. The scale of loss is almost incomprehensible. An area of land larger than modern-day India, a world of rolling hills, river valleys, and dense forests, vanished beneath the warm waters of the South China Sea and the Java Sea. Coastlines retreated by hundreds of miles. What were once inland settlements became coastal villages, and then those too were swallowed, forcing communities into a constant, generational retreat. This was not a single event but a relentless pressure that reshaped human life at its most fundamental level. For the people living on this sinking land, adaptation was not a choice but a matter of survival. Those who had once hunted in interior forests now found themselves on shrinking peninsulas, with the ocean visibly claiming more of their world each generation. This environmental pressure catalyzed a revolution in technology and strategy. Reliance on maritime resources became essential. Simple rafts evolved into more sophisticated boats capable of longer voyages and fishing in deeper waters. Navigation skills, once useful for river travel, were now critical for understanding currents, winds, and the stars to travel between the ever-shrinking patches of high ground. The drowning of Sundaland did not just change how people lived, it permanently fractured where they could live. As the waters rose, populations were pushed toward the remaining highlands, the mountainous cores of islands like Sumatra, Borneo, and Java that had once been inland regions. These highlands became isolated refuges, islands within islands. Groups that retreated to these areas were cut off not only from the mainland but often from each other by newly formed straits and channels. This prolonged isolation, lasting for millennia, had a profound effect. In these separate highland valleys and plateaus, languages diverged into astonishing variety. Cultural practices evolved in unique directions. Genetic lineages that had once mixed freely on the open plains now grew distinct. This process is the deep root of the breathtaking cultural and linguistic tapestry we see in island Southeast Asia today, a diversity born directly from geographic fragmentation. The story of Sundaland's end is therefore a story of both loss and creation. A vast, connected world was sacrificed to the rising sea, but in its place, the sea created a vast archipelago, a maze of islands that would become a cradle for some of history's greatest maritime cultures. The very waters that took a continent away would soon become the highway for the Austronesian expansion, a story for another time. But that latest saga of exploration across the Pacific began here, in the memory of a lost land, and in the resilient adaptation of a people who learned to master the element that had taken their home. Even the world's greatest rainforest was once a more open country. For decades, the vast Amazon basin has been viewed as the ultimate green fortress, a dense, impenetrable wall of vegetation that naturally divided the continent. Yet, emerging research paints a far more dynamic picture, one where the forest itself has a history of expansion and retreat, governed by the same global climate rhythms that shaped deserts and coastlines. During prolonged drier periods, particularly at the height of the last ice age, the mighty Amazon did not vanish, but it transformed. The continuous canopy fractured, giving way to islands of forest separated by expanding patches of open savanna and woodland. This created a broken landscape, a mosaic where the rules of movement were completely rewritten. For the early peoples of South America, these dry phases did not present a barrier but an invitation. The open corridors of savanna acted as natural highways cutting through the continent, allowing for relatively easy east-west movement across the basin. Groups could traverse these grassy stretches, following game and connecting with other populations in a way that would be nearly impossible in the dense, closed rainforest we know today. This connectivity may have fostered a broader exchange of ideas and technologies across the continent during these arid windows, but the climate, as always, was a fickle architect. As the Ice Age waned and global precipitation patterns shifted, the rains returned to the Amazon with renewed vigor. The forest began to reclaim its territory. Slowly, over centuries, the savanna patches shrank as the advancing tree line closed in. The open corridors that had served as continental highways were gradually pinched off and then swallowed entirely by the advancing green wall. The great east-west routes across the heart of the continent were sealed one by one. This reforestation had a profound isolating effect. Populations that had once been connected across the open landscapes found themselves trapped in separate forest refuges, their worlds now bounded by rivers and endless jungle. With overland travel between these refuges becoming exceedingly difficult, the major river systems, the Amazon itself, and its countless tributaries became the new arteries of life and movement. Isolation along these winding waterways led to spectacular diversification. Over generations, separated by only a few miles of dense forest but worlds apart in experience, cultures developed unique languages, mythologies, and technologies. What we see today as an almost unimaginable tapestry of indigenous cultures and languages in the Amazon, particularly concentrated along its rivers, may be the direct legacy of that ancient climatic closure. The forest did not create this diversity from scratch, but by fragmenting a once connected world, it provided the perfect conditions for that diversity to flourish in splendid isolation, a testament to how even the mightiest of ecosystems can open and close doors on human history. Even the grand sweep of the ice ages eventually gave way to a more recent, yet still profound, reminder of our planet's influence. The story of human migration is not confined to the distant past, as a climatic shudder known as the Little Ice Age demonstrates. Beginning around the 14th century and lasting into the 19th, This was not a return to continental glaciers, but a significant and prolonged dip in global temperatures. Its effects were felt most sharply in the world's high places, where the cold wrote a new set of rules for movement. In the European Alps and the Rocky Mountains of North America, glaciers that had been in retreat for millennia suddenly awoke, grinding forward once more. These rivers of ice did not just reshape barren peaks, they reclaimed the very pathways people relied on. High mountain passes that had been open for centuries, vital arteries for trade, communication, and seasonal herding, were choked with ice and snow. The route over the Great St. Bernard Pass between Switzerland and Italy, for instance, became far more treacherous and often impassable for longer periods, severing a critical link. In the Andes, similar glacial advances isolated communities, cutting off exchange between highland and lowland regions. This was not a permanent closure, but a seasonal strangulation that squeezed economies and reshaped lives. The consequences rippled far beyond the mountains themselves. With reliable overland trade routes disrupted, the cost and risk of moving goods soared. Communities that depended on this exchange for essential supplies or for selling their own products faced hardship. This environmental pressure coincided with and exacerbated periods of agricultural failure. Cooler temperatures and unpredictable growing seasons led to repeated crop shortages across Europe and Asia. The result was a cascade of crises where failed harvests, combined with the breakdown of trade networks, created desperate conditions. In many regions, these subsistence crises became the direct catalyst for migration. People were forced to leave their ancestral homes not by curiosity or gradual expansion, but by the immediate need to survive. Some moved from highland villages down into valleys, increasing competition for land there. Others embarked on longer, more desperate journeys, contributing to larger patterns of displacement and resettlement across continents. The Little Ice Age stands as a powerful, recent testament to a fundamental truth. The great earth changes that opened and closed the doors for humanity did not cease with the end of the last glacial period. Our planet's climate remains an active participant in our story, capable of altering the map of human opportunity with a shift in temperature barely noticeable in a single lifetime, yet powerful enough over decades to redirect the course of communities and cultures. It is a final, sobering lesson in humility, reminding us that the routes we take are always, in some way, borrowed from a world that is forever changing beneath our feet. 20 journeys, 20 gates, each one a testament to a single, profound truth. Our story is not one of a species conquering a static world, but of a restless traveler navigating a board game where the very tiles are constantly sliding, sinking, or rising from the sea. From the grassy plains of Beringia to the drowned forests of Doggerland, from the green heart of the Sahara to the icy corridors of the Rockies, these were not passive backdrops. They were active, demanding participants, the ultimate gatekeepers of human destiny. They dictated the terms of every meeting and every parting. A land bridge like the Sinai funneled entire populations, while a supervolcano like Toba may have pruned our family tree to its very roots. A rising sea did not just flood a coast, it severed Britain from Europe and created the islands of Southeast Asia, forcing isolation that bred breathtaking cultural diversity. A desert did not just sit there, it pulsed like a heartbeat, opening lush corridors of connection for millennia before slamming shut and stranding cultures in oases of memory. Each change forced a choice: adapt, move, or face an ending. This relentless environmental pressure was the engine of innovation, pushing us to build boats to cross the Bab-el-Mandeb, to develop new tools for hunting on the Mammoth Steppe, and to forge social bonds strong enough to survive a volcanic winter. It explains the patchwork of languages, the distinct genetic lineages, and the scattered archaeological records that puzzle us today. They are not random fragments, but the direct legacy of doors opened and closed by planetary forces. We are the children of climate and tectonics, our global distribution a living map of ancient opportunities seized and barriers endured, and this grand game is not over. The planetary changes underway today, from the steady creep of sea level rise to shifting climate patterns, are already beginning to redraw the map of human habitation and connection once more. They ask us to consider what new routes will open and what familiar shores might we lose. To understand our future on this shifting Earth, we must first listen to the stories written in ice, stone, and sea, the deep history of how we came to be everywhere. The mystery of our past is the key to navigating the changes ahead, a journey of discovery that continues with every new clue unearthed from the ground and every new connection revealed in our shared DNA.